Velma, what an absolute pleasure to have you in the studio in conversation with the Branson Center. I know we're going to have a very good conversation around community, around purpose, and how to enable entrepreneurs. And so welcome to the studio and to this conversation.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Always a delight to be in conversation with you. So Velma, before we start, who is Velma?
So I am a mum of two crazy redheaded children. I think maybe my purpose was to procreate or to ensure the survival of the ginger species.
We like the color red, so we approve.
I'm also a crazy runner. I love nothing more than, being on the trails or on the mountain over the weekend. I suppose, and I'll talk about my job in a second, but part of the reason why I landed up there is because I love travel, anything new, exploring places. And then what I do, my day job is I work for Airbnb as their regional lead across Middle East Africa.
That's exciting. And I think what makes it exciting is that it's already leading us into certain aspects of this conversation is because who you are is made up of different facets, and those facets in themselves have their own networks, their own communities, and give you the whole. And so maybe I am squashing in a very specific element where I want this conversation to go, which is Airbnb, landing on your job, is really an organization that's enabled by community, whether it is a community of hosts or a community then of users. It cannot just stand alone as a platform. That platform is bringing together these communities. And we think that's something and we can easily assume that that's something that will only exist for Airbnb because of the nature of its business. I'm curious to find out what your take is on what is community and what is community in relation to entrepreneurs thinking about it.
Okay. So maybe I can back up a little bit and just talk about how Airbnb thinks about community. And I think the first and sort of most fundamental part of that is that, we are a community. That is, we don't see ourselves as a platform. We are really, at our absolute core, we're a community that enables engagement and belonging.
Great.
And when we think about community, we think about it in three different ways. So there's the core of the community, and that is what we would term our hosts and our guests. And really what the platform is designed to do is to enable hosts and guests to connect seamlessly and to really enable that like richness of connection and belonging. And what the platform does is it allows them to do that with trust and peace of mind. And so we design things like we make sure that there's safe payments so that you don't have to worry about, is this person that's coming to my house paying me? We have the review system, so you have a sense of comfort about who the person is. We've built an insurance. So it's really so that all of that stuff that could get in the way of the connection and belonging is taken care of.
Right.
So that's absolutely kind of most fundamental. And, we obviously have to do that at scale because we've got more than 4 million hosts. Over 1 billion people have used the platform. It's across 220 countries and, tens of thousands of cities. But then beyond that community of hosts and guests have got an impact. So we also think about what is their impact in the neighborhoods, in the towns, in the cities, in the countries in which they live. And so we also think about our business, about how do we show that our community is good for communities more broadly. And so, based on that, we've done things like really working hard to have partnerships with cities and governments to ensure that you've got regulations that are enabling for hosts, but also good for those cities. We think about noise and nuisance tools and a whole host of things that we build around the ecosystem to try and ensure that our hosts or our community is good for communities. And then the last way in which we really think about communities is how do we ensure that our community of hosts and guests is reflective of the communities in which those in which they find themselves. So, a really good example, and this is probably what I'm most passionate about, is in South Africa. So when I started, Our host community looked very much like me.
Right.
Predominantly white, somewhat middle-aged. But that's not the country that we live in. Also, there was so much incredible tourism potential in township communities and rural communities. And there were these people that were offering that, you could go stay in their homes, and they were offering experiences, but they weren't on our platform.
Right.
And so what we had to do was understand, okay, why weren't they on the platform? And we realized there was a whole lot of barriers that were enabling these that stopped these micro entrepreneurs from getting access through a platform like Airbnb. And sometimes it was around confidence. It was like, oh, this platform doesn't look like it's for people like me. It was skills. It was access to devices, to Wi-Fi. And so we've developed a whole program called the Airbnb Entrepreneurship Academy. And that's really designed to overcome some of the barriers that people from township and rural communities face to be successful on the platform. And so those are the three ways in which we typically think about community.
Okay. And I'm going to assume that kind of also aligns with where you stand in terms of what community means, because this is the role that you're in, and this is what you represent through Airbnb. And I think what's so interesting about that is it does hit on the philosophy that even the Branson Center espouses in terms of saying it's about, from our side, being part of building an inclusive economy that enables thriving people who are sustained on a healthy planet. And so, community impacting on community, but then reflective of
yes, absolutely.
Community,
yes. And so it's not just about the community on the platform, but really understanding the broader impact and the ecosystem.
Yeah. And so I think it starts to answer the question, when I'm looking at my business, so I'm a purpose-led entrepreneur, I am growing my business, I'm trying to understand, do I have a community? What does my community look like? Where do I have an impact? But it's saying that these questions aren't necessarily separate from what's going on in your business, because you just need to have almost a definition. I'm kind of answering my own question. Sorry. But where I'm curious, because, entrepreneurs tend to say, I hear what you're saying, but it's not that easy for me to, integrate this thinking in terms of growing my business and to think about community. So I want to know, Velma, if I'm sitting and I'm growing my business, how do I think about community, and who in my business should be holding the conversation around interrogating what community is for our business?
Yeah, so that's it's a great question. And I can really only speak from an Airbnb perspective, but it's so interesting because we don't really think about community and business as two separate entities. And I think it's less about like, how does the business shape community, and more how does community shape business.
Right.
So, let me, and it hasn't always been that way. So, I think there was a time pre-COVID where we were trying to do a whole lot of kind of different things. Then suddenly we're faced with March 2020, COVID is a pandemic, and bang, within 2 weeks, Airbnb loses 80% of its business. Everybody's saying, will Airbnb survive? And we went from being in that position to the end of 2020 having one of the most successful IPOs in history, not just for a travel company, but any company, any time, to, in the last quarter of 2022, having our most successful quarter ever.
Wow.
So you go, how did we do that? And it was because we went right back to our core, and we said, what can we do better than anyone else? And what we do better than anyone else is we have a community of hosts that can offer hosted experiences to guests. And it's very easy to replicate design, but you can't replicate community as easily. So we said, okay, well, how do we then make sure that our hosts can offer the best hosting experience? And so we had to do two things. So one is we really, really started to understand what the experience was for our hosts and really do kind of, I think in the last 2 years, we've done like 450 different upgrades to the platform, really focused on hosts and guests. So we made it as easy and as simple as possible for hosts to keep on hosting. And we also, or to sign up, we changed our kind of insurance policies, etc., to really support hosts. And then we said, okay, well, because COVID has been the biggest change to travel since the advent of commercial flying.
Right, yes.
For business you're fairly familiar with. So, and we started to see all of these really, really interesting trends emerge. And the most important one is flexibility. So suddenly you see that because people are no longer tethered to their workplace, they can be really flexible. And so travel started to change. It was not just about going on a holiday, but you started to see life, work, travel blending into one. People were a lot more flexible about where they were going, so they're trying lots of different places. They were using travel as a way to connect with family and friends, and they were going and they were living anywhere.
Yes.
And so, we really built those changes into the platform from the guest side. So the whole way through, what we're doing is we're not just assuming that the community or our hosts or our guests will just be there. We are really constantly talking to our hosts and getting their opinion on what we're doing. And so in order to support community, we have set up things like we have a host advisory board. And there, whenever we're wanting to make a big decision or we want a new policy or we want to do something, we talk to them. We have host club leaders in, I don't even know, thousands of host club leaders, thousands of host clubs. And what's amazing, this is our biggest source of market research, data. They can tell us what they think about policies before we've even launched them.
Right.
So there's so much value in really, really, really engaging them. And, what I would say to, any entrepreneur who's sort of saying, well, do I engage my community? What's the point of doing that? I think it's a bit like, can either be like a virtuous or a vicious cycle. So you engage your community, you listen to what they have to say, you use them as a source of market research and they become more and more engaged, they're recommending your product to other people. You've got this great kind of network effect.
Right.
But at the same time, the opposite can happen because it's people at the end of the day. It's not machines. The opposite can happen. You don't listen to them. You don't develop products for them. And then they can, it can as easily, your community can turn on you. And, one of the harshest lessons we learned as a business was sort of in the midst of the kind of the March 2020
the
COVID
firestorm.
crisis. There was a firestorm. Travel advisories were literally changing by the minute. And we had to act really, really quickly. And what we did is we implemented a blanket extenuating circumstances policy, which basically meant that if you were traveling because of COVID, you could cancel your bookings. But that also meant that hosts lost so much money and they were left out. And, it really backfired. I think we may still stand by the decision because we didn't want guests to feel like they had to travel if they were uncomfortable. But there are lots of more nuanced ways we could have done it. But we didn't speak to our hosts about it and we just implemented it. And there was a huge backlash, which then resulted in us having to spend, it was a costly mistake because we then had to spend $250 million, finding ways to put money back into host pockets. And also we had such a big job of doing, to try and rebuild some of that trust.
So I really appreciate you bringing this lesson and a rather expensive lesson into this conversation, because I think some assumptions exist that once we bring in this word community, it's a word that maybe exists for businesses that aren't real businesses. Community speaks to, nonprofits or businesses that are, reliant on grants, and not big, businesses that have probably, for example, the largest IPO in history, doing really successfully. And so bringing in the mistake of what happens when you neglect your community or sometimes put them in your blind spot, it is an expensive decision, and it means it then in the opposite end tells us that community is important. And so I think what I'm curious about here, and maybe what I'm hearing, or maybe what I want to hear, is where does purpose fit in as we start thinking about nurturing and then also being in partnership with our community?
So, I think the challenge sometimes with purpose is, and I'm talking about it from a tech platform or tech company point of view, is that I think purpose can often be very lofty and very big. Google, do no evil.
Yes.
But I think for me, purpose comes in terms of how you walk the walk every day rather than talking the talk. And I think it's very easy to say, this is our mission and we want to change the world in this way. But actually, every day, are you prioritizing, really understanding your community? Are you prioritizing making decisions that will, impact your community over and above profits at certain points in time? And I think, from if I think about, what always amazes me about Brian Chesky, our CEO, is that, he has the kind of the community so kind of core to his heart. He doesn't go and sit in his ivory tower. So this year, the big trend, as I've spoken about, that we're really seeing is this kind of flexibility and how people are untethered to their workplaces. And we believe like this is the thing that is going to drive the future of travel. And what Brian did at the beginning of the year says, okay, I'm gonna live anywhere for a year. And in doing that, he has really got back into using the product, experiencing it, understanding what it's like from a guest perspective, really understanding what are the pain points. And so using that as a way to kind of direct the way that the platform is being developed. So we did a big announcement last week, which was really around how are we categorizing stays. We've launched an insurance product for guests. We've thought about how do you split stays over kind of longer term stays. But also, he's been very, he's also felt that, that's something that we should all be living. And so as a company, we now have a work from anywhere policy, which means that nobody in the company has to go back to working in an office 5 days a week. Anyone in the company can go and work for up to 90 days a year in any foreign location, obviously if they get a visa. But, but sort of really building that flexibility into the way that we are. And so I think it's very much about what are the decisions that you make on an everyday basis. And I think, one more thing that I just want to say, which is really interesting for us about community, is that we think about our community as hosts and guests, but actually you've got a two-sided marketplace. And so that example that I shared about, when we had the extenuating circumstances policy, we erred on the side of the guest.
Yes.
And so you've got this two-sided marketplace, and sometimes if you, and you really have to walk a bit of a tightrope in balancing the needs of kind of hosts and guests. And sometimes, we lean a bit more on the side of the guests and sometimes a bit more on the side of the host, and sort of always be kind of talking to your community to kind of figure out like, okay, well, we're on this tightrope. Are we getting it right?
And perhaps the other question is, are we okay? Is it correct for us to also think about our teams as being part of, the community of this business? So you talk about the marketplace in terms of guests and hosts, but listening to you, describe now the same policies and the same philosophy that we're using to make our assumptions about guests and hosts is now being applied in the business, meaning that the business is also viewing its people as community.
Absolutely. And maybe what I should have said at the start is that there are 4 ways of thinking about it. And one of, because, one of the things that we've said that we want to be as a company is a 21st century company. And that's really, a company that does good by all of its stakeholders. And at the core of that is employees. Then we have our hosts and our guests and our communities, and then it's the communities that they live in, and you sort of have these concentric circles, and you go out from that. But absolutely, it's, employees are key. So it's about, making sure that our offices, when we all used to go back into offices, but, the offices felt like home and that there was a sense of connection and belonging. The way that we're designing the future of work is also saying, okay, well, maybe people are remote, but how do we bring people together so that there's always a sense of connection and belonging, and also then making sure that your employees or your team are using the platform and that they're engaging with the platform as much as possible. So we're all encouraged to host and to be hosts. We're all encouraged to travel, which nobody's really kind of complaining about.
That doesn't feel too difficult at this point.
But yeah, I think everybody wins if your employees are invested in the community.
I'm so excited because it speaks to, I'll fold in our purpose, which is the Branson Center's purpose is actually copy and paste of the Virgin Group's purpose, which is to change business for good, which means that, as lofty as that sounds, but every single decision we make on a daily basis, the question is, when we make this decision, are we changing business for good, whether it looks like remuneration or leave policy or who we then include as our partners. And so it's so nice to know that we as the Virgin Group, we as the Branson Center are part of a community of like-minded businesses that are businesses of the future. And so wonderfully typified by Airbnb and, of course, wonderfully typified by you, Velma, leading the business here in the region. And so as we wrap up, some quickfire questions, which most people want to run out the room the moment I start. But don't please stay. It's great belonging. Thinking about community means?
How do you connect?
A business that understands its community is a business that?
Is better... is probably going to be better able to have long-term sustainable growth.
Purpose-led businesses enable a community to
have to be about more than just profit.
A founder who doesn't understand the business's community is a founder who
is probably going to learn some very hard lessons.
Thank you so much, Velma. I've appreciated this conversation. It's so interesting in terms of, there were so many things firing around different things in terms of culture, around people, around partnerships. And so it feels like there could be more conversations between you and me about community, but diving deeper into certain areas of business growth.
I would love that.
Yay.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time.